I'm so deep in this shit now. It's like, how did I get this deep without like crashing into the mountain? Games aren't reality, but you can compare decisions the developers made in games to make them more realistic in a sense. Vintage Story will be our first look into this realism design that can lead to not just immersion, but also fun play. Vintage Story is just like Minecraft, but it isn't. But let me explain. Minecraft has relatively simple and fast crafting mechanics, whilst Vintage Story takes a more realistic approach. For example, how to make your first weapon or tool? You get 2 rocks and hit them with each other, preferably flint, and grab a stick, and boom, you got the needed tool. Now, how to smelt your first copper bar? Well, you see, first you need clay, which you dig with a shovel, then you form a crucible out of that clay. You can find clay on the map, and remember, mark it because it's fairly hard to see. Now you need a fire. Get your knife and take some dry grass, a total of 2. Then use 1 dry grass, 2 sticks to make a fire starter. Then chop down many trees and use your axe on the logs to make firewood. Then use the dry grass on the ground, add the firewood, then start with the fire maker, and cook a stick to make a torch for the night. Now place the crucible in the fire and cook it into a solid clay crucible. Search around for copper bits. Once you find them, mark the map and saying you found copper there, and take the bits so you can melt them. 20 bits are needed for 1 bar of copper. Now to make fuel that can smelt copper, so we need to chop down lots of trees for a ton of firewood, and we burn the firewood underground to make charcoal. Whilst the charcoal is cooking, make a pickaxe mold and harden it with a campfire. Now once you get the charcoal, know this. Charcoal burns up to 1300 degrees Celsius, and copper melts around 1084 degrees Celsius. When it's done, pour it into the mold so we can make a pickaxe head. Harden the mold and pour 20 copper, which is 100 copper units, into the mold. Let it cool, then take it out. Put it on a stick and bam, a pickaxe. Now you need a hammer to break down the copper you mine in order to melt it down in a crucible. Do the same thing, but a hammer mold, and repeat the same steps. Now that was a lot, right? We'll now find 900 units of copper, about 180 copper, to make a copper anvil. So get to those marked spots and get mining. Once you make an anvil mold and fill it to get an anvil, then you can just hammer heated ingots into the shape you need, pouring the copper into ingot molds, waiting for it to cool off, and then putting it back into a forge to finally heat it up, and then putting it on a anvil to then finally be able to hammer the copper bar into shape. You can also cook food in a cooking pot, which requires at least 2 meat, 2 fruit. I recommend learning cooking because this keeps you well fed. You can also make storage vessels for food/storage, and can use horsetails to make baskets, which requires 2 in these slots to make, which the baskets increase inventory size. Also a nutrition system that, if you have a balanced diet, gives you more hit points. And honestly, to me, that realism is fun, since it takes a while to progress and how it isn't handed to you on a silver platter. Now that I told you the basics, and this game is your sort of thing, have fun. But the main reason for covering this game is because it's a perfect example of a game that has a world with rules that the player has to follow. And by having to follow these rules set by the world, it gives a feeling of fulfillment in progressing further down the game, giving a sense of progression and deserved reward. It also shows that realism doesn't need to be unfair to be fun. Overall, Vintage Story is a realism-based game with mechanics, freedom, difficulty, and discovery. Mechanics are to me solid. They require effort to make things. Getting items takes more hassle, causing acquiring the items to be more rewarding. Vintage Story has a ton of freedom, but the rules of the world stops the player from getting too far, too fast, making progress extremely satisfying when achieved. This in which rewards that player's efforts. The difficulty is difficult in the sense of patience, and nothing is a small feat. There is a lot of detail in all the different things that have to be done to progress, which requires some time to learn, making the game more complex in the learning department. And finally, discovery. The game doesn't hold your hand and everything can be overwhelming at first, but when you finally get the ball rolling, everything around you starts to build up and eventually it all just comes together, starting to make sense. In addition, Vintage Story is coded in C#, making the game much more stable and mod-friendly. Looking at Java code for Minecraft, you will notice that it is really unstable, especially if you add in servers or mods. But from my experience from owning a cheap server on Vintage Story, I experienced little to no server problems. And what is probably causing this is how unviable large animal farms are. Since it takes more effort to set up a farm, and killing one animal is enough resource for 3 to 4 nutrition bar fillings, pretty much making lower entity counts and forming a higher stability server. All of this is why Vintage Story is a 9 out of 10, a great experience for what kind of game it is, and made by a relatively small indie dev team. We covered the effect of a world and the rules set in the sandbox of Vintage Story, and the effects of this on the gameplay. But the world and the rules set in sandboxes are not the only things to think about, but that's for next time.